Pam Bondi sat in the CBS studio's dressing room, adjusting the folds of her elegant ivory-colored blazer. She was accustomed to TV interviews, but this time something fell off. "Ms. Bondi, we're live in 5 minutes," said the young assistant, peeking through the door. She nodded and turned her gaze to the mirror. Her image, cold, confident, flawless, had always worked. But today, it seemed like things weren't going according to plan. As she stepped onto the stage, the audience applauded, though there was a noticeable tension in the air. Stephen Colbert greeted her with his customary broad smile, but there was a hint of mockery in his eyes. "Ms. Bondi, welcome to our studio." "Aren't you worried about tough questions?" he began, leaning forward slightly. "I'm used to bluntness, Stephen, so let's get started," she replied, keeping her posture straight. Colbert flipped through his cards as though picking what to start with. "Well, let's talk about justice." "You're for justice, right?" "Absolutely," Bondi responded briefly. "But is it just to take $25,000 from the Trump Foundation and then suddenly close the investigation into Trump University?" The studio fell silent. Bondi barely pressed her lips together. "This has nothing to do with that." "Oh, really? Just a coincidence." Colbert interrupted, pulling out a piece of paper from the stack. "Because it says here that you received a check just days before deciding not to file charges. Do you consider that a coincidence?" The audience held its breath. Some people in the back row began whispering. Bondi straightened up, took a deep breath, and began to respond. But she had no idea that the real blow was still to come. Pam Bondi barely pressed her lips together, but her eyes remained calm. She had faced uncomfortable questions before. "This is a completely false interpretation of the events," she said, staring directly at Stephen Colbert. "I made decisions solely based on the evidence, not on donations or political influence." Colbert smiled, as if anticipating her response. "Interesting. Well, perhaps you'll explain why, after this independent review, the Trump Foundation suddenly allocated funds directly to your office? Just a coincidence? Because, the viewers might think this looks like a bribe." A wave of whispers spread through the studio. Bondi kept her face impassive, but her fingers trembled slightly as she straightened her back. "It seems to me, Stephen, that you're playing on emotions, not facts," she said, gazing at him confidently. "Facts." Colbert theatrically leaned toward his desk, pulled out a few sheets, and raised them into the air. "Here's a copy of a report confirming that your campaign received $25,000 from the Trump Foundation at the same time you were making decisions about Trump University. And here's another fact. When asked about this, your office claimed it was an error in the reporting. But the money was only returned after journalists started digging deeper. Is that also a coincidence?" Pam Bondi knew that in moments like these, it was crucial not to let her opponent take control. "I'm not going to sit here and let you distort the facts in front of millions of viewers," she said, her voice steady but with a metallic edge. Colbert raised his hands, as if surrendering. Okay, let's change the topic. You're for the rule of law, right?" "Of course." "Then please explain how you could support bills that restrict voting rights when statistics show that such measures disproportionately affect the elderly and minorities." This was a low blow. Pam Bondi knew that many viewers were from those very demographics. She collected her thoughts and replied, "I support fair elections. And if security measures such as voter identification help prevent fraud, then that only strengthens our democracy." Colbert slowly shook his head. "The problem is, over the past 20 years, there have been virtually no significant cases of election fraud in the U.S. But these laws disenfranchise thousands of people, including veterans, who may not have an up-to-date ID because of bureaucracy. Do you still consider that fair?" Pam Bondi knew she was being cornered, but she couldn't afford to show weakness. "My job is to defend the law and order, not to succumb to media manipulation." Colbert smiled, as if he already knew he had won. "Law and order? That's interesting, because during your time in office, the number of arrests in poorer neighborhoods significantly increased, while major financial crimes remained virtually unpunished. Don't you see a problem here? Pam Bondi gripped the armrest of her chair, but held firm. I defended the interests of the people of Florida, and my job is to speak the language of facts, not media manipulation. Colbert leaned forward. Well, Ms. Bondi, the viewers will make their own conclusions. A silence hung in the air, and although not a muscle twitched on Pam Bondi's face, inside she felt that this was a blow she wouldn't easily recover from. The room was filled with tense silence, and the audience was watching intently as events unfolded. Pam Bondi began to feel her palms sweating, though her face remained impassive. She was no longer sure if she could get out of this situation without serious damage to her reputation. Colbert watched her with a slight, yet clearly skeptical expression. He understood that this moment would be a challenge for her and couldn't resist asking further questions. All right, let's move on to another issue that also raises some questions, he continued. When you supported the decision to reject reforms in the criminal justice system, didn't that seem too harsh? Many attorneys, including in Brighton, where I grew up, believe it actually worsens social inequality. And, as a result, many innocent people, particularly African Americans and Latinos, were affected. There was another moment of silence in the studio. This was a question Pam Bondi found difficult to answer. She realized she had lost the support of many who believed in her professionalism. But she decided not to lose control. My goal has always been to promote justice, Stephen, she replied, her voice firm, though the tension was visible in her eyes. I supported reforms aimed at reducing crime rates and supporting victims of crime. All these decisions were made in the interest of the citizens, without any intention of discrimination. Colbert leaned forward, his voice turning serious. But how do you explain the fact that arrests among minorities increased under your policy? You yourself said that you were trying to stop the criminalization of poverty and racial minorities. But these changes only worsened the situation. What do you say to that? Pam Bondi blinked, but there was no panic in her voice. She understood her reputation was on the brink of collapse. However, she refused to give in. I believe we must take responsibility for our actions, she said, trying to appear confident. The criminal justice system should not be a tool for political battles. All these decisions were made thoughtfully, and we did everything we could to ensure equality before the law. Colbert asked her the next question, which was undoubtedly a heavy blow. But why were there no investigations when your staff and you personally received large donations from the same people whose cases you later had to review in court? He asked, raising his voice. Do you really think this doesn't violate the ethical standards of your job? The studio froze. The audience couldn't tear their eyes away from the screen, waiting to see how she would react. Pam Bondi felt her heart start to race, but she didn't let her emotions show. These accusations are completely unfounded, she said, trying to control her tone. Everything I did was in accordance with the law and principles of justice. All the issues you're raising have already been addressed by the appropriate authorities. I work to ensure a fair process for everyone. Colbert raised his eyebrows and then addressed her again. But, Ms. Bondi, many people believe these decisions were more about your political career than the interests of justice, he said, his voice sounding more serious. And if we look at your recent decisions regarding voting laws, these questions become even more significant. Do you really feel like this situation doesn't concern you? A moment of indecision flashed in Pam Bondi's eyes, but she quickly forced herself to pull together. My role is to ensure that our laws work fairly and impartially, she said again, her voice firm but noticeably tired. If I've done something wrong, I'm ready to take responsibility for my actions. But you must understand, I've always acted within the law. Colbert tilted his head, looking at her, then smiled ironically. Well, that sounds like a good answer. Although, some people might not believe what you've said. But we'll revisit this issue later. The room erupted into soft applause, but the atmosphere remained tense. The audience could feel that the situation was far from over, and the questions remained unanswered. Pam Bondi sat still, almost motionless, understanding that this interview would have serious consequences for her, but there was no turning back. The studio once again fell into tense silence, and signs of exhaustion were already visible on Pam Bondi's face. She sat there, trying to keep herself composed, but her gaze was no longer as steadfast as it had been at the beginning of the interview. She knew that these questions were leaving her with no chance to exit without damage to her reputation. Colbert, as always, did not let her off the hook. His smile faded, replaced by a serious, almost imperceptible expression. He could feel that his questions were truly hitting a nerve. "Let's continue," he said, giving her the chance to respond to the last question, which was obviously going to be the most difficult one. "In your career, there have been many instances where you stopped investigations that could negatively affect your political allies. How can you justify, for example, halting investigations into large corporations, or even refusing to investigate criminal cases involving high-profile individuals?" The room froze. It was a moment when everyone realized that any wrong reaction to this question could end the interview on a catastrophic note for Bondi. She took a deep breath, trying not to appear offended, and answered calmly, "My job has always been to ensure equality before the law, Stephen. You can ask your questions, but I will tell you that every decision was made based on specific evidence. If there were gaps in an investigation or conflicting testimonies, I could not just close my eyes to it." The answer was so clear that even Colbert hesitated for a moment before raising his hand for another question. Feeling that she had regained a bit of the initiative, he decided to add another attempt for pressure. "We all remember your recommendations on failed investigations involving certain political figures. How can you justify the fact that, as a result of these decisions, no one who, according to your own words, should have been held accountable was punished?" he asked, slightly shaking his head. It was a tough question, but Pam Bondi didn't lose her composure. She looked straight into the cameras, not letting her emotions show, even as she felt the audience beginning to doubt her integrity. She knew this could be a fatal moment. Gathering all her confidence, she said, "I made these decisions not based on political preferences, but with the understanding that justice must be independent of politics. I've always worked to ensure maximum transparency in the process, and even if it seemed unclear to the public, that was part of the commitment to the law." Colbert, realizing this was a standard answer without specific facts, decided to break this routine and make one final move that might overturn everything. "Here's another thing that concerns me. Your close ties with certain lobbying groups. How do you explain that? Viewers are starting to question why, when you were reviewing decisions, you admitted to these connections, and why that didn't influence your policy," he asked, raising his voice. The room fell silent. The audience started actively checking their phones to verify Bondi's statements, which she had so convincingly confirmed. Doubts were already creeping in. The sense that the situation was slipping out of her control was beating in her chest. "My relationships with others were and are at a high level of ethics and agreement," she replied, though it was clear that each word was hard for her to say. "We always worked within the bounds of the law, and if you're referring to lobbyists, they have the right to have their say in public life, just like anyone else." Colbert lowered his gaze slightly, realizing that she had once again dodged the sharpest points. But he wasn't ready to give up. His last question still hung in the air. "But is it fair that we saw public financial reports where lobbyists, for your political activities, not only funded your campaigns, but also helped fund the legal cases in which you participated? This is more than just connections, Ms. Bondi, don't you think?" he asked. The room erupted in whispers again, and the studio was on the verge of exploding, ready to find out how she would respond to this question. The answer to it would determine whether her image would remain intact or be completely destroyed. Remembering that her career was on the line, she answered as calmly as possible. All financial reports are publicly available, and I have no doubts about their contents. All these connections are part of working in a rule of law system, where it is necessary to interact with different parties to achieve justice. If this raises questions among people, I'm ready for that. But I have always acted within the law. Colbert tilted his head, looking at her response, and then summed up. Well, folks, that was Pam Bondi. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. We'll be back after a short break. Everyone knew that for Pam Bondi, this was more than just an interview. It was a battle for her political future. And while she appeared confident, every movement of hers revealed that, perhaps, this moment would be decisive for her. After the pause, the studio came to life again. The cameras were ready to capture every movement, every word. Pam Bondi had calmed down a little, but she still felt the tension in the air. All eyes in the studio were on her, the audience, who had been following her career for years, journalists, her political opponents, and Colbert, who left no room for easy answers. After the commercial break, the show continued. Colbert summed up. Now, Ms. Bondi, let's return to some less political questions. What can you tell us about your relationships with certain large corporations? I mean, don't you think your policies could influence the economic decisions of these companies? How can you be objective in this regard? It was another precise blow, but no less important. The previous questions had touched on legal and political matters, but now Colbert was trying to find out whether her policies influenced the entire economic system. Everyone watching the show knew that such questions had the potential not only to affect her political reputation, but also the trust of the people who depended on her. Pam took another deep breath and sat up straight, trying to stay calm, but this time her eyes were more alert. She knew very well that any wrong move could destroy everything. My stance has always been that corporations must act within the law. I have never allowed any party to influence my decisions. They all know that I support the market, and the interests of small businesses come first for me. All my actions have always been aimed at helping people who live and work in our state, not pleasing large corporations. When it comes to legislative activity, I have always followed principles of equality and transparency, she responded. After a pause, as the studio began to settle down again, Colbert decided to return to what still troubled him. Yes, but don't you think that public campaign funding, or even help from large companies in the form of lobbyist support, is a form of mutual influence? Doesn't that really violate the idea of neutrality in your political position? He continued, not leaving her room for evasion. The audience in the studio listened carefully, as each such question was on the verge of scandal, and any answer could determine whether she could maintain her image as an independent politician. Bondi, feeling that every word she said could be decisive, responded, This question you've raised is important, but I can say that all my actions have always been for the benefit of the people, not the companies. My policies are aimed at creating better conditions for all citizens, not just for certain companies or people. I have always openly shared information about my connections with other groups, and this has always adhered to standards. Applause began in the hall, but it was weak and quickly faded. The earlier questions had been so deep that even these applause couldn't fully ease the tension. Colbert tried to shift the interview to a different angle. Nevertheless, during your campaigns, you often spoke to the public, emphasizing your independence from large corporations. How do you respond to the fact that a recent investigation revealed links between your campaign and companies that use the same strategies you criticized? He asked, raising the stakes even further. The answer Pam gave to this question was just as calm, but with a heightened tone. I am open to criticism, and everything I do will always be subject to analysis. I don't see an issue with receiving support from business if it helps people. What matters is that I remain honest in my intentions, and I believe my actions contribute to the prosperity of the community. I don't make decisions to favor certain people or companies. My job is a balance of interests, where I am always on the side of truth and justice. The audience couldn't help but feel the tense atmosphere that remained in the studio. This interview had become not only a showcase of political strategies, but also a serious test for Pam Bondi's career. Colbert, realizing that he wouldn't be able to ask any more questions that wouldn't worsen the situation for Bondi, promised to continue the discussion in another part of the show. Concluding the interview. Well, that was interesting, Ms. Bondi. Thank you for your candor. I hope the audience gained more clarity about your policies. We'll be back after the break. Once again, the camera stopped, and the studio fell silent as everyone wondered. Would Pam Bondi leave this interview with the same political positions she had before, or would her career take a serious hit? The cameras faded out again, and the studio slowly began to dissipate the tension. Pam Bondi sat in her chair, feeling the adrenaline still coursing through her body. The interview with Colbert had been a test on the edge of her career. The questions had been sharp and critical, but she remained calm, though she understood that not everyone would be satisfied with her answers. After the break, Colbert returned, and the show smoothly continued, but the atmosphere had already changed. The audience, who had recently been keen to watch the political exchange, was now more interested in whether Pam would weather the storm. The interview had taken on a sensational character, as more and more people began discussing it on social media, forums, and even in the news. The next day, after the show aired, the news was flooded with headlines highlighting every word spoken during the interview. The press conference Pam held in the morning confirmed her position. She stated that all her connections with large corporations were part of her job, and that it was a perfectly normal aspect of politics in the modern economy. She also declared that she would not abandon the principles of fairness and equality that guide her work. However, the voices of her opponents were quick to follow. Critics claimed that Pam was trying to defend political connections that contradicted her declared independence. While she managed to defend her position, her trust among voters had been somewhat shaken. She realized that despite her carefully prepared stance, the show had become a test of her resilience. However, in politics, as in life, it's important to stand firm in moments of trial. A few weeks after the show, her popularity among certain voter groups even grew, but trust in her policies among others had weakened. This was the natural result of the interview, which placed her under scrutiny, but also opened new opportunities for further political maneuvering. Now back in the spotlight, Pam decided she had to be even more cautious in her actions. The show left its mark on the country's political landscape, making people reflect on how important it is to maintain a balance between personal connections and public responsibilities. And while it seemed that everything in politics could be measured and analyzed, the reality was much more complex. Every move, every word, every decision could become decisive. This was not just another test moment for Pam Bondi, but for everyone working in politics, because the real struggle for power and the trust of the people always takes place on many fronts. And every moment can be decisive. And with these thoughts, the interview concluded.